everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me once again is Matt Taglia, the Senior Director of Emerson College Polling. Matt, thanks so much for joining me.
Hey, Brittany, thanks for having me.
I'm excited to talk about Emerson College's latest poll out. It's their national poll in February. The big top line is President Trump's approval rating. There's bad news for the president, though. His disapproval rating shot up by 4 points within the last month. So to start off the conversation, talk to us about how people are feeling about Trump.
Yeah, Brittany, as you said, his disapproval has shot up since just last month. Now, I do have to note that this poll was taken before the State of the Union, although I'm not sure that that would have made much of a difference here. So we see that his approval is at 43%, disapproval 55%. His approve is unchanged. So I think we do see something like a floor. I wouldn't be surprised to see that move one way or the other over the next couple of months, but probably not too much farther beneath that 43%, I think. But this is by far the worst number that we've seen for President Trump in our tracking. Minus 12% disapproval overall. That is a tough place to be, a majority disapprove, and it's especially tough heading into the 2026 midterm elections.
I guess my next question would have to be, why did that number shoot up? And I'm thinking about all of the news in the past month and the headlines really since the beginning of the year. The Venezuela operation where U.S. forces took Maduro. I'm thinking about the ICE operations and the immigration enforcement operations in Minneapolis. Two American citizens were killed by federal agents there. I'm thinking about Iran. I'm thinking about people's feelings on the economy. Does that all contribute to why that disapproval is going up?
I definitely think it does. And I think that you touched on some issues there, some actions by the administration that may be having an effect on Trump's approval rating. So if we look at Hispanics in particular, we see that they have shifted since last month. They now are at 58% disapprove versus 37% approve. Last month, we saw they were close to even in approval versus disapproval. So that has totally changed here. And I think that probably does have something to do with the news cycle and some of the administration's actions over the past month, and even just some of those news stories settling in. We also see that independents, who I think right now sort of represent the median voter, that sort of middleman in the electorate right now, they disapprove overall fairly overwhelmingly, 56% approve or disapprove versus 42% approve. Again, that is a tough place to be in a midterm election year. We know that the president's party tends to lose seats in Congress, but a 14-point net disapproval or 12-point net disapproval and 14-point net disapproval among independents overall, that is not what I want to see if I'm a Republican.
And before we get to the impact on the midterms, I am curious that the approval rating, the 43% number, that stayed stagnant from January to February. Why is that despite the disapproval moving?
Yeah, great question, Brittany. There is a segment of voters out there, and it is that roughly 40 to 45% who are ride or die Donald Trump. And, I think that number is dwindling among the electorate. I think as we get closer to the actual election, we'll see how much that changes, whether that is really a ride or die vote there, whether they can be persuaded. But, this is likely voters that we're talking about, and we are expecting a lower turnout scenario among Republicans. So these are those Republicans who are going to approve of Donald Trump, and then some of those independents as well, who are unlikely to move but are still movable.
Like you said, if I was a Republican right now looking at this, running for office in 2026, these aren't numbers I want to see, especially because Republicans have control of the House, the Senate, and the White House. And like you said, historically, that's not good. It's almost like a bloodbath situation come midterm elections. So how is this affecting Republicans and Democrats at all?
And when we look at the generic ballot, we see, again, the largest number for Democrats here, the largest number away from Trump that we've seen in all of our polling over the past year. So 50% say that they intend to vote for a Democrat on the congressional ballot versus 42% for a Republican. 8 points there. That's an 8 point spread. That, we had talked last year about how this number wasn't moving that much, that Democrats and Republicans were very close. Republicans led at certain points in 2025 in our testing. That is no longer the case. That ship has sailed, and it's very unlikely to come back to the harbor here unless Republicans start doing something very differently, or unless the electorate starts to look very different from how we expect it to look in the midterm elections. We do still see that there's that lag. So there's that 12% net disapproval for Trump versus this 8%. And I think that that's really just, some folks are holdouts. They're not necessarily willing to commit to voting for Democrats, but this is still alarm bells for Republicans. This is a tough place to be.
And when you break that down by demographic, when you see that there are more people supporting the Democratic candidate, they're beating the Republican candidate 50 to 42%, and 50% of independent voters are going to the Democrat over 37% who are voting for the Republican. I mean, what trends there when it comes to demographics are popping out to you the most?
I think that independent number that you cited, that is really the most. And I think that all of these candidates are, in any sort of competitive district, they're going to be vying for those independent voters. So 50% right now of those independent voters are supporting the Democrat versus 37% for the Republican. That they're going to really have to make up some ground there. These independent voters will be decisive in some of these races. In some races, frankly, it won't matter as much because Democrats are very likely to have an advantage in some of these closer districts, or even some of the districts where Trump won in 2024. Democrats may, in fact, have an advantage there. So, that is a number that we're really looking at nationally as we try to get cues for how some of these closer districts are going to go. But Republicans are going to have to at least be tied among independents to be competitive in some of those districts.
I do now want to look into the future a bit more, even into 2028. And let's start by looking at the 2028 Democratic primary for president. For a while, Governor Gavin Newsom, he's been one of the top contenders. He hasn't said officially if he's going to run or not. However, this week, he did put out his memoir, and that's usually a precursor for someone announcing their presidential ambitions. So how is he faring in this poll, and who are the other top contenders?
Yeah, I think that we're all anticipating that Governor Newsom is going to step into the race. And right now, if he did, he would be the leader in the field. 20% of Democratic voters plan to support him. Buttigieg is next, Pete Buttigieg, with 16%, followed by former Vice President Harris with 13%, AOC 9%, Shapiro 7%, with 24% undecided. So again, he would walk in as the immediate front runner here, but I think we are starting to see the field start to take shape and folks begin to choose a camp. Some of these candidates developing their own sort of base, as you might say, of support. Newsom, especially, he has a few places where he can draw from, and then some of these other candidates as well have their own little basis of support.
Yeah, talk to us about those bases a little bit more. Who's going where? Where are you seeing anything that's sticking out or surprising?
Yeah, so let's start with the front runner, Newsom. We see that he is winning among Hispanic voters. Now, I think that this could be really important if, say, the Democratic Party is still figuring out exactly which states are going to go first. But if Nevada is an early state, that could be really important. And I think that he would automatically have a little bit of a leg up just being in the neighboring state of California. He also wins among college grads and folks who have had some college. He also wins among men, and then very crucially, voters over the age of 50. Now, we always expect in these primaries that older voters are going to form at least a plurality, if not a majority. So winning among those voters is huge. If he can maintain that, then I think he's going to be in really good shape. As we look at some of the other candidates, Vice President Harris, she's still overperforming among Black voters with 36%. Otherwise, she doesn't have too much of a base of support. Otherwise, AOC, she has some interesting support. As you might expect, She is winning among some of the younger voters. So those, that could end up playing a role if we see something where turnout approaches levels like we saw in New York City in 2025 in some of these states. Then that could make a big difference. And then finally, Pete Buttigieg, he also has pretty solid support. He's in second place in our poll here. He's winning among post-grads, and he does well enough with other demographics. But I think we do see that he has this sort of base among the most educated in the electorate.
And undecided is even beating Governor Newsom here. Undecided's at 24%. How much do you think that matters here?
Of course it matters, Brittany, as always. But, we've got a lot of time. We still have about 2 years until voting starts. But they're all going to be vying for these undecided voters. We know that undecided voters tend to be more so women and more so younger folks. So, there's a lot of space there for any of these candidates to win some of those voters. I think especially someone like AOC, who hasn't necessarily sealed up that young vote yet. If she could, convince those folks to actually turn out for one of these early states, and that could be a game changer.
I think you put this conversation in a really interesting perspective that we still have 2 years until we are going to be talking about primary votes for this election. I mean, we have a long way to go right now, but something in our conversations about 2028 that has remained consistent is the GOP frontrunner, and that's Vice President J.D. Vance. Talk to us about where Republicans are going.
Yeah, you're right, Brittany. And, things have not changed too much. But we see that Vance has a majority among the electorate. 52% of Republican primary voters plan to vote for Vance, assuming that he runs. Another 20% say Rubio, and then DeSantis with 6%. All others are in the single digits. So, this is really Vance's race to lose. But I will say, Rubio is a new face in our test here at the national level. We did test him previously, but it wasn't an explicitly stated test. It was where we asked folks to name their candidate. And so he got very few votes there. So this is a major rise for him. And I think we're seeing some discourse around Rubio among conservative voters that they like what they're seeing. And 20% is certainly a threat here to Vance's lead.
Like you said, we are well over 2 years until Election Day 2028. So historically, is there a danger in being one of the top contenders so early? Does that give you more chances to make mistakes on the national stage, more chances for perhaps critical coverage of every comment you make? I'm thinking of Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez with her recent commentary in Munich. That got a lot of criticism. Also, Governor Newsom on his book tour, his commentary on his SAT scores, that faced a lot of backlash. Does it give more time for other contenders, your competitors, to drop Oppo research on you? Does it give dark horse contenders more time to come up with a strategy against you? I mean, what do you think about that?
It's a really tough needle to thread, I think. You do want to build momentum ahead of your announced run. And even thereafter, you want to build more momentum. But being in the field too early and having so much media attention too early, it is very much a double-edged sword. So I completely agree. I think that there probably is a sweet spot, and that is sometime in 2027, we'll start to see some of these candidates announced, and really in late 2027, where we'll start to see them actually hit the campaign trail in some limited capacities. So yeah, I don't think that necessarily anything really good comes from being this early in, especially certainly not in 2025 and 2026. I think you can lay the groundwork and you can get out there and have your face in front of people, but being a sort of front runner in the race is not necessarily a good thing.
Well, Matt, per usual, I appreciate your numbers. I appreciate your perspective here. Thank you so much. And until next time.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Brittany.